If cultural studies was simply about trying to understand the distortions which the media make of a meaning whose truth we could somehow find independently of the media, it would be a very different kind of study from what it is in fact, which is trying to find out how the meanings enter into the event themselves, how they help to constitute the event. And this, what we're talking about is really why in cultural and media studies of this kind, at any rate, the notion of culture becomes a primary force. It's not a secondary element, but it's a primary element. Culture is a way in which we make sense of or give meaning to things of one sort or another. It's true, of course, that we all don't make sense of things in the same way, and therefore that each of us has a little kind of conceptual world of our own, or rather we have our own sort of take on the conceptual world. But if we shared no concepts together with other folks, we literally could not make sense of the world together. We could not build a social world together unless we were able to make sense of the world in, broadly speaking, the same ways. Cultures consist of the maps of meaning, the frameworks of intelligibility, the things which allow us to make sense of a world which exists but is ambiguous as to its meaning until we've made sense of it. So meaning arises because of the shared conceptual maps which groups or members of a culture or society share together. And that's a very important kind of way of coming to an understanding of why in cultural studies, if you privilege the notion of representation as giving meaning, you're making culture a very central, you're giving it a kind of central role. Yes, it's not just sort of the values and things which we happen to have been born into. It literally is the ways without which we would find the world unintelligible. Okay, what then is sort of the basis of a culture, consequently of cultural studies, is to try to begin with what are the shared conceptual maps. That's to put it another way, to give you another way into this notion. What are the ways in which we classify and organize the world? Because classification is not the only, but one of the principal ways in which we go about giving meaning to things. Until we know roughly what class of things it is, roughly what it belongs with, and roughly what it's different from. Chairs are like stools because you sit on them. And both of them are different from tables which you put things on, although you can also sit on tables. And so our systems of classification are very complex, but without some notion of this belongs with that, that is different from this, we wouldn't be able to have a conceptual map. We wouldn't be able to map out the world in some intelligible way. Now, where do we get that from? Well, the one thing you can be certain is that though the capacity to use concepts and to classify concepts in this way is a biological or genetic phenomenon, it's a feature of how we are constituted as human beings, the particular classifications that we use to classify out the world meaningfully is not printed in anybody's genes. It is something which is learned. It may not be learned in didactic ways at school or in colleges or through instruction, formal instruction, but to become a human subject is precisely somehow to learn or internalize the shared maps of meaning with other people in your culture. To become a cultured subject, rather than a biological individual, rather than just a blob of genetic material, is to move from there, to internalize, have within oneself the kind of the beginnings of the grid of one's culture. Okay, one could say then that the conceptual maps in our heads which allow us to come to a sense of what is going on in the world, is itself a system of representation. Our concepts are a way of representing the world. And you can think of that in a very simple way. I mean, bear in mind an object which you cannot see. Now, unless you had a concept of it, it would disappear the moment that the object had gone from sight. But concepts allow us to store and indeed to refer to and to think about quite complicated thoughts about objects which are no longer accessible to our perceptual apparatus. So the concepts allow us also to think about a wide range of things which are not in any simple sense out there in the world. And it's a very rich notion. Our fantasy life is full of things which are absolutely real to us, which are probably real if we can only find a language to express them, lots of other people, which nobody's ever seen. So we're beginning to dissolve now any simple-minded notion that our concepts are just mirror images of the world out there. They're also mirror images of worlds that don't exist. I want to take an example in which some of the ways in which people in cultural studies and media studies have tried to explore this process of making or the production of meaning, how they've tried to get into what we call the practices that produce meaning. And that idea, incidentally, is a very important one, the notion that the production of meaning is not therefore something that just happens because the world is already fixed out in its meanings, which don't change. The production of meaning means that there is a kind of symbolic work, an activity, a practice which has to go on in giving meaning to things and in communicating that meaning to someone else. And it is that practice of the production of meaning, the practice of what are called signifying practices, practices that are involved in the production of meaning, that media studies is concentrated on. It's concentrated on the effects and the products of signifying practices, practices that are carrying meaning and that in our world happen to be widely circulated by the media being one of the most powerful and extensive systems for the circulation of meaning, although one ought to always remind oneself, especially in media studies, that the media are by no means the only means by which meaning is circulated in our society. I mean, the most obvious way is in actual talk and conversation with other people, in personal communication. That is the medium in which the exchange of meaning absolutely saturates the world. But of course we are right noticing that to see what happens when systems, complicated institutional systems with complicated technologies, then intervene and take the place of face-to-face, person-to-person communication and exchange, and the means of circulating those meanings become very widespread. Because, of course, the question of the circulation of meaning almost immediately involves the question of power. Who has the power, in what channels, to circulate which meanings to who? But it's why the issue of power can never be bracketed out from the question of representation.